Welcome to another exciting podcast for biology. This is Mr. Mechnik, and welcome to Energy in Ecosystems. So, the focus of this podcast will look at how sunlight produces energy for plants and can harness that energy and produce lots of sugars in the form of stored chemical potential energy. So, as we go through this today, I really want you to focus on how energy is transferred from the non-living world to the living world. So to begin with, during an ecology unit, one would want to understand connections made between living and non-living things. So an easy way to demonstrate this is in a food web, which shows the flow of energy between living organisms. The idea behind this diagram is simply the yellow arrows don't indicate necessarily what eats what, but how energy flows from this crow to this coyote, or how the shrew transfers its energy to the coyote. And we will take a look at how all of these different types of webs can be represented in a simple energy pyramid and show how energy can be lost as we go from the bottom to the top. So looking at energy flow in ecosystems, we should understand what an ecosystem is. So an ecosystem basically is the conglomeration of all the abiotic factors in a system and the biotic components. So the term abiotic is referring to non-living parts of the environment, and the biotic components are referring to the living parts of the environment and how these things are connected together. So in the biotic section, we can see the plants, the consumers. These are all organisms that are living. The fungus, bacteria, which are decomposers, they play an important role to help recycle the abiotic components like gases, nitrogen, oxygen, water molecules, different minerals. All of these things are part of the nutrients that flow through the ecosystems but are considered abiotic because they are not alive. So when we analyze an ecosystem and we look at energy flow through the system, we can do this in a couple different ways. One way is to look at what's called a food chain. So a food chain is a simple representation of the producers and how the energy gets transferred to the consumers within a single line or single energy transfer. And we can look at these single transfers of energy in a couple different forms. We often use pyramids to represent energy, and so at the bottom of a food pyramid, we see that there are a lot of producers which contain the most available energy in that ecosystem. As you go up towards the top, there is less and less energy available. So we can use energy pyramids, we can use biomass pyramids, and numbers pyramids to represent food chains in an ecosystem. Each one of these individual levels is called a trophic level. These are the different levels that organisms can feed at or obtain energy from. So for instance, in an energy pyramid, we would like to have in a normal stable ecosystem most of the energy at the base of the food chain. So these are your primary producers. They produce their own food. And as we will learn, most of the energy in an ecosystem should be at the primary producer level. So just to use some made up numbers for the sake of this presentation, let's assume that a given food plot had 10,000 calories worth of energy. The energy that then becomes available to the primary consumers will be 1,000 calories. And as we go up, only 10% of that energy becomes available to the next level. So this is known as the 10% rule. The 10% rule is a generalization about how much energy can be transferred from one trophic level to the next. So where does all the energy go? We have 90% that's not being transferred from the producers to the consumers, so on and so forth. So what we can see is that most of this energy, 90% of the energy that these plants have, is not available in these consumers because a lot of this is lost in the form of heat. So heat energy loss from the system is represented in blue. So as living things metabolize sugars and use sugars to make ATP, all of that chemical conversion is losing heat energy. Every single chemical reaction that happens in living organisms releases some degree of energy. And the more we move up the pyramid, the more energy there is that's lost in each one of these levels. Another way to analyze an ecosystem is to look at the number of organisms within that ecosystem. So if we were to look at the primary producers, ideally we would expect to see more producers than consumers. So at the bottom of a numbers pyramid, we would try to quantify how many of those organisms are producers. And as we move up the pyramid, we would see that there are less and less of these consumers available. So the total number of top level carnivores in an ecosystem are always a lot less than the number of primary producers, simply because there is not enough available energy to support a large number of top level carnivores. And it's the same with the biomass. Biomass is referring to how much living matter there is in an ecosystem. And for a stable ecosystem to exist, there must be more biomass, living matter, at the base of the food chain. So again, using some numbers for the sake of this presentation, if we assume there's 280,000 kilograms at the producer level, this amount of biomass can only support about 11,800 kilograms at the next level. Again, energy gets transferred. As energy gets transferred, organisms use that to help reproduce and grow and develop and to make biomass. And so in a normal ecosystem, we can't have more mass at the top of the food chain than we do down here. Even though sometimes our large top-level carnivores might be large organisms, they just can't have a large population of them. There can't be a large number of them to sustain a normal ecosystem. And ultimately, we look at energy flowing through an ecosystem, but we can also look at how nutrients are recycled. And so these decomposers play a significant role in all ecosystems, and they are the recyclers in nature. They help recycle dead organic material. And as we look at different types of food chains and food webs, these guys always play an important role in putting nutrients back into the soil so plants can grow and develop, and those nutrients can be transported to other heterotrophic organisms. And there's two main types of decomposers, the detritivores and the saprophytes. So just to kind of review a few things, if we look at this particular food web, it shows many connections between organisms. Obviously, these producers are what are making the sugars for everything in this ecosystem. So if you could write down in your notes which organism in this diagram would be the most abundant, the greatest in numbers, which would be the least abundant, which ones have the most energy content per unit, and which ones would have the greatest amount of biomass in this system. So as we, again, review a little bit, in ecosystems, we can look at different trophic levels. The bottom of a food pyramid, the bottom of a food chain, these are your primary producers. These are the ones that have most of the energy directly from the sun, stored chemical potential energy, and then is transferred to the consumers. So if we work our way through a food chain, we can see that the primary producers convert sunlight into chemical energy. That chemical energy can be consumed by herbivores or the primary consumers. These primary consumers can store some of that chemical energy, only about 10%, and then 10% of that energy can be transferred to a carnivore. These are your secondary consumers. Sometimes these might also be omnivores if they can eat both plant material and animals. And then as we move up, we have the third level, which are called your tertiary consumers, and your fourth level in an ecosystem are your quaternary consumers. So as we started with, the first slide showed a diagram of a food web. Food webs are just a really good way to indicate how energy flows through an ecosystem. It shows some of the connections, not all of the connections between living things, but it's a nice way to analyze an ecosystem to see how stable a system is and how the energy can flow through it. We can look at many factors that might influence a population. For instance, in the oceans, are salmon being overfished? If they are, how does that affect the harbor seals? How would overfishing of salmon affect bald eagles or killer whales? That can have a significant impact on this whole entire system. So when we look at food webs, it's an easy way for us to, I shouldn't say easy, it's a difficult way for us to try to understand some of the connections and realize how important all of those connections are. So again, this slide is somewhat redundant because I have been alluding to food chains, but again, the purpose of a food chain is simply to show how energy flows. The biggest point to emphasize in a food chain is the direction the energy is flowing. The arrows always point from the bottom to the top of the food chain. So it's not, even though this zooplankton eats the algae, the arrow is pointing from the algae to the zooplankton. That's where the energy is transferred. 10% is stored in this little tiny zooplankton, and the fish eat it and get 10% of the energy that's stored in that zooplankton, and so on and so forth. Soon.